one of the most infamous crimes in British history, and it's remained unsolved for more than 500 years.
In Westminster Abbey, a marble urn proclaims with carved certainty that two lost princes rest inside, yet their bones have never faced a single DNA test.
Well, one potential way to find out more about what happened that night would be to forensically examine the prince's bones.
The same technology that unmasked Richard III could expose a centuries-old deception in weeks, but the Crown and the Church will not allow it. What secret could be so damaging it is protected by a royal and religious ban? The answer begins with the story behind Britain's untouchable tomb. Marble, cold and unyielding, encases the story. In Westminster Abbey, a white urn stands beneath the shadow of kings, its inscription carved in Latin with the authority of a royal command. The words declare that Edward V and his brother Richard of York lie within, their identities sealed as fact by the order of Charles II. The date is 1678. The Restoration monarchy, newly re-established after decades of upheaval, is hungry for order and certainty. Charles II instructs that the bones discovered in the tower 4 years earlier, two small skeletons found 10 feet beneath a crumbling staircase, be given the dignity of royal burial. He commissions Sir Christopher Wren, the master architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, to design the urn and the monument. The inscription does not hedge or question. It proclaims with the full weight of the crown that these are the lost sons of Edward IV, murdered in their youth, recovered at last. The phrase, by undoubted proofs, is cut deep into the stone, transforming a hasty 17th century guess into an official verdict. No forensic test, no scientific inquiry, just the confidence of royal decree and the artistry of Wren's chisels. The Abbey, already a national shrine, now becomes the final resting place for a mystery supposedly solved. The choice of words, the grandeur of the monument, and the solemnity of the ceremony all work together to erase doubt from public memory. In a country still unsettled by civil war and regicide, the monarchy needs legends that cannot be questioned. The urn's message is not just about two missing boys, it is about the power to decide what is true. Over centuries, visitors read the inscription and accept its certainty, never realizing how much of it rests on politics, not proof. Stone and script become the guardians of the narrative, daring anyone with new evidence to challenge what has been said in marble. The urn at Westminster Abbey has remained sealed since 1933. Not a single modern forensic test has touched the bones inside. After the brief inspection allowed by George V, limited to X-rays and a visual check, the lid was closed again, and with it the possibility of scientific certainty. No radiocarbon dating, no DNA extraction, no isotope analysis. Every request for further study has hit the same wall: absolute refusal. The Abbey and the Crown, acting together, have enforced this silence for nearly a century. Official records confirm the last time anyone examined the remains was during the Tanner Wright study. That investigation, using the best methods of its day, could only guess at the ages and number of individuals. The tools to answer the real questions, who these children were, when they died, where they grew up, simply did not exist. Since then, advances in genetics and archaeology have solved mysteries once thought unsolvable, but the prince's bones have been kept off limits. No chain of custody audit, no peer-reviewed publication, not even a fresh inventory of what the urn actually contains. The authorities have not just declined to test, they have made testing impossible. The legal power to open the urn sits with two offices, the Dean of Westminster and the reigning monarch. Both have repeatedly denied permission, sometimes after private consultation, sometimes in carefully worded public statements. The files now open at the National Archives show a pattern. Every proposal for scientific study, whether from historians, journalists, or geneticists, is quietly blocked. The Abbey's official line is respect for the dead. internal correspondence reveals deeper anxieties about public reaction, about the risk of overturning accepted history, about the consequences of being proved wrong. The urn's unbroken seal stands as a barrier not just to science, but to certainty itself. The story remains frozen in place, not by lack of evidence, but by a deliberate decision to keep the past unresolved. In a world where DNA can identify a king from a parking lot, the refusal to test two small skeletons in a marble urn leaves only one question. What truth is so dangerous that it must be kept locked away? Edward V was 12 years old, his brother Richard just 9, when the world they knew vanished behind the stone walls of the Tower of London. Their father, King Edward IV, had died suddenly that spring of 1483, leaving the crown to a boy not yet a teenager. The Tower, for all its later reputation, was not just a prison, it was a royal palace, a place where kings and their families lived in safety and splendor. The two boys arrived under the watchful eye of their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been named Lord Protector. To the public, it looked like a careful transition. The young king and his brother kept close while their uncle managed affairs of state. Through that summer, witnesses reported glimpses of the boys. They played in the gardens, attended chapel, and sometimes appeared at the windows. Their presence was a matter of record. Servants, courtiers, and even foreign visitors noted their movements. But as the weeks passed, those sightings grew less frequent. The last credible reports placed them inside the tower in late summer of 1483. After that, the trail goes cold. No official announcement, no body, no confession. Only silence. The disappearance sent ripples through the city. Londoners whispered about the fate of the heirs. Some believed the boys were merely being kept out of sight, perhaps for their own protection. Others suspected something darker. Rumors spread that Richard, now crowned Richard III, had ordered their deaths to secure his claim to the throne. The absence of the princes became more than a family tragedy. It threatened the legitimacy of the new king and cast a shadow over the entire royal house. The stakes were enormous. These were not just any children. Edward and Richard were the living symbols of the Yorkist dynasty, the last direct male heirs of Edward IV. Their survival or death would determine whether England's crown passed peacefully or by force. Every day they remained missing, the sense of unease grew. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, fearing for her remaining children. Political factions began to form, some supporting Richard, others quietly looking for a way to restore the princes. No one could produce proof of life or of murder. The lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. Chroniclers recorded the anxiety of the court and the city, but even they could not say what had happened. The fate of the boys became the question on which the future of the monarchy seemed to hang. Their story, unfinished and unresolved, set in motion centuries of speculation, accusation, and myth. The need for answers would drive generations to search for physical proof, to dig beneath stone and story in hopes of finding the truth. But in the summer of 1483, all that remained was the memory of two boys, last seen behind the walls of a fortress that was supposed to keep them safe. July 1674, Tower of London. Masons break apart a stone staircase, their hammers echoing through centuries of royal intrigue. 10 feet below the surface, in the dust and rubble, a small wooden box is pulled from the earth. Inside, tangled and incomplete, lie the bones of two children. At first, the workmen toss them aside, treating the discovery as another piece of debris. Only when someone wonders aloud if these might be the lost princes does the box become precious. The lieutenant of the tower takes custody, but there is no meticulous record, no sketches, no inventory, no forensic chain of evidence. The bones pass from hand to hand, their story already slipping into hearsay. The official account leans heavily on coincidence. The location matches a rumor published by Thomas More nearly 150 years earlier. The princes, in their sleep, buried beneath a stair. For the Restoration Court, desperate for a neat ending to an old scandal, this alignment is enough. The bones are declared authentic, not because of scientific analysis, but because the narrative fits. When the remains are transferred to Westminster Abbey, no one checks for mixing or contamination. No one asks if animal bones or fragments from other burials might have slipped in during the chaos of demolition. The box is simply sealed in marble, its contents now a matter of national faith. For over 2 centuries, the urn remains untouched. Not until 1933 does anyone dare to open it again. Lawrence Tanner, the Abbey's archivist, and Professor William Wright, an anatomist, received special permission from George V. Their tools are limited: plain X-rays, tape measures, and the naked eye. They find 2 partial skeletons, but the bones do not form 2 complete children. Some fragments are missing, others seem out of place, possibly from a child younger or older than the princes. There are scraps of velvet, but the fabric cannot be dated or matched to any royal wardrobe. The examiners note these problems, but their conclusions are cautious, hedged with uncertainty. Their report, thin by modern standards, is accepted as conclusive by the authorities. The urn is closed again, the evidence locked away. Today, the flaws in this process are impossible to ignore. The original find was mishandled from the start, bones mixed, context lost, documentation absent. The 1933 inspection, though well-intentioned, could not resolve the basic questions of identity, age, or even the number of individuals present. No chemical tests, no DNA, not even radiocarbon dating. The only certainty is uncertainty. Yet the official story persists, unchallenged by the kind of scrutiny that modern science demands. The result is a paradox. The most famous child skeletons in British history are also the least examined, their identity resting on the thinnest of forensic ground. The call for 21st century testing grows louder, not just to satisfy curiosity, but to correct a legacy of error and assumption that began the moment those bones were pulled from the dirt. Inside a modern forensic lab, the science that could solve the prince's mystery is routine work. Ancient DNA testing now requires only a sliver of bone, less than 100 milligrams, sometimes the size of a lentil. The petrous portion of the temporal bone, nestled deep in the skull, yields more DNA than any other part of the body, even after centuries. Teeth, especially molars, are another goldmine. With careful drilling, scientists extract powder without destroying the visible structure, preserving the integrity of the remains for future generations. Lab protocols are strict. Every sample is handled in a clean room under filtered air with researchers in full protective suits. Tools are single-use or sterilized between each drill. Chain of custody logs record every handoff, every tube, every fragment. Negative controls, empty tubes run alongside real samples, guard against contamination. In reputable labs, each result is independently replicated, sometimes on a different continent, before anyone dares to publish a conclusion. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, the same method that identified Richard III, tracks the maternal line. The prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, has living female line descendants today. A match between the Abbey bones and these descendants would confirm the identity as securely as science allows. The process is robust. Even degraded, centuries-old samples can yield enough mitochondrial DNA for a match, provided contamination is kept below 3%. In the Richard III case, the match was achieved with less than 1% modern contamination, setting a standard for royal remains. Y chromosome analysis offers a second line of evidence, tracing the male line. Thanks to the sequencing of Richard III's skeleton, the Plantagenet Y chromosome profile is known. If the Abbey bones share this signature, it would tie them to the royal bloodline, unless, as recent studies suggest, an undocumented break in the male line occurred. Even so, a mismatch would not close the case, but it would raise new questions about succession and legitimacy. Radiocarbon dating using just 50 to 100 milligrams of bone can place the death of the individuals within a window of decades. If the bones date to the late 15th century, the case for the princes strengthens. If they fall outside that range, the entire narrative unravels. Stable isotope analysis drawn from tooth enamel and bone collagen reconstructs childhood diet and origin. Royal children raised in luxury show distinct chemical signatures, high-status protein, wine, and imported foods. Strontium and oxygen isotopes can even pinpoint if the children grew up in England or abroad. All these tests are minimally destructive, leaving the remains visually intact and scientifically transformed. The protocols are transparent, the data open to peer review. In the last decade, these methods have solved mysteries from Siberian tombs to Egyptian mummies. The technology is not experimental. It is the gold standard. The only barrier is access. The urn at Westminster Abbey, sealed by decree, remains untouched, not because the science is uncertain, but because the questions it could answer are too dangerous for those who hold the keys. A car park in Leicester, 2012. Archaeologists cut through tarmac and earth, searching for a king lost to history. The skeleton they uncovered was twisted, the spine curved by scoliosis, the skull caved in by a fatal blow. Within months, scientists at the University of Leicester matched mitochondrial DNA from the bones to living relatives of Anne of York, Richard III's sister. The identification was not based on legend or rumor, but on genetic code, confirmed in a peer-reviewed study and accepted by historians worldwide. For the first time, a medieval king's identity was established beyond dispute, using technology that could fit in a backpack and protocols that left the remains almost untouched. This was more than a scientific triumph. It was a direct challenge to centuries of official stories and royal myth-making. The Richard III Society, once dismissed as eccentric enthusiasts, found themselves at the center of a global debate. Turi King, the geneticist who led the DNA analysis, explained the process in plain terms. A fragment of ancient bone, a swab from a living descendant, and a match so precise it left no room for doubt. The remains were reburied with full honors, but the science had already rewritten the script. Then came a twist that unsettled even the experts. When the research team compared Richard III's Y chromosome, the marker passed from father to son, they found it did not match the supposed male line descendants of the Plantagenet family. The published results, reviewed by geneticists and historians, pointed to a false paternity event somewhere in the royal line. The break could have occurred generations before Richard or as close as his own father. The data could not say who, when, or why. But the implications were immediate. The bloodline that fueled the Wars of the Roses, the legitimacy of kings and claimants, suddenly rested on shaky ground. The story made headlines. Newspapers asked whether the Plantagenet dynasty had been built on a fiction, whether the crown had passed through hands that were royal in name but not in DNA. For institutions that guarded royal history, the shock was not just scientific but constitutional. If genetic evidence could upend 500 years of lineage, what would it do to the stories enshrined in marble and stained glass? The Richard III case became a warning. Once the lid is lifted, the truth is not always what you expect. Historians, forensic scientists, and genealogists all weighed in. Some called for caution, noting the small sample size and the possibility of multiple breaks in the family tree. Others saw the results as proof that even the most sacred narratives could be tested and sometimes found wanting. The debate spilled into academic journals and public forums, fueling calls to apply the same methods to other royal mysteries, beginning with the princes in the Tower. The precedent was clear. Modern science could answer questions that tradition had kept closed, but it could also raise new ones, with consequences no one could fully control. Every scientific request to examine the Westminster urn runs into the same immovable wall. No test, no exhumation, no disturbance of the bones can happen without the written consent of both the Dean of Westminster and the reigning monarch. This is not a custom or a suggestion. It is codified in church statutes, reinforced by the Abbey's status as a royal peculiar, and anchored in the ecclesiastical jurisdiction measure of 1963. The dual approval rule means that even the most compelling forensic proposal is dead on arrival unless both the Abbey and Buckingham Palace agree. In the 1990s, as DNA technology matured and public pressure mounted, the machinery of refusal became visible in a paper trail now housed at the National Archives. The files show a choreography of denial in a clear paper trail, letters from Dean Michael Maine, careful consultations with Home Office ministers, and quiet confirmation from the palace. When campaigners pressed for carbon dating and DNA analysis, Maine's replies were firm. He cited the dignity of the dead, the risk of public confusion, and the example of the Turin Shroud, a scientific controversy that, in his words, had left more questions than answers. Behind the scenes, he sought advice from government officials and royal advisors, weighing every angle before sending his refusals. The Home Office file from 1995 records that ministers, including Home Secretary Michael Howard, were consulted, as was Buckingham Palace. The Queen's private secretary confirmed the monarch's full agreement with the Abbey's decision. The language is precise. Both offices were in full agreement that the matter should not be reopened. No conditions, no offers of compromise. The refusal is not about the limits of science, it is about the limits of permission. The pattern is unmistakable. Every proposal for forensic study, whether from scientists, historians, or journalists, triggers the same process. The Abbey and Palace confer, ministers are briefed, and a letter of refusal is dispatched. The reasoning shifts as needed. Sometimes it is respect for royal remains, sometimes the fear of setting a precedent, sometimes the specter of reputational risk. But the result is always the same. The official position is presented as a matter of principle, but the confidential correspondence reveals a deliberate policy, a firewall built to keep the past undisturbed. This coordinated veto stands in sharp contrast to the rapid approval granted for the Richard III DNA project. There, institutional doors opened after a public campaign and the promise of historical clarity. Here, the doors remain bolted even as new evidence and new descendants come forward. The double standard is not lost on campaigners. The Abbey and Crown have made a choice. Uncertainty is safer than truth, and the power to say no is more valuable than the answers science might bring. Philippa Langley sits at her kitchen table, a stack of letters and DNA consent forms in front of her. She is not a royal, not a scientist by training, but she helped find Richard III's skeleton under a city car park and proved modern genetics can rewrite history. Now she and a growing network of campaigners are determined to apply the same science to the urn in Westminster Abbey. Their case is simple. The technology works, the controlled DNA exists, and the stakes, truth and justice and historical integrity, are too important to ignore. The scientific groundwork is already laid. Elizabeth Roberts, a living descendant in the female line from the prince's mother, has volunteered her DNA. Her sample, quietly couriered to a university lab, sits ready for comparison. If the Abbey allowed even a single molar to be tested, a mitochondrial match could prove the bone's identity within weeks. The Plantagenet Y chromosome profile, established from Richard III, offers a second, independent check. Never before has a royal mystery been so close to a definitive answer, if only the barrier would fall. For campaigners, the refusal is not just frustrating but infuriating. They point to the Richard III precedent. There, public pressure and persistent activism forced open doors that had been shut for centuries. Crowdfunding, petitions, and international media coverage made it impossible for authorities to ignore the demand for answers. The same tactics are now being deployed: letters to Parliament, open appeals to the Dean, even a petition signed by thousands of citizens and historians. Each time the response is the same: a polite but unwavering no. The ethical debate is fierce. Supporters of testing argue that the princes, if these are their bones, were victims of a crime, children whose fate deserves to be known. They see forensic science as a tool for justice, not just curiosity. But the Abbey and its defenders invoke the sanctity of the grave. They warn that disturbing the urn risks setting off a chain reaction with demands to test every disputed royal tomb. The specter of the Turin Shroud looms large in their arguments. A scientific test that was supposed to end debate instead spawned decades of controversy and confusion. Dean Michael Maine's 1995 letter to the Home Office made the comparison explicit, warning that ambiguous or contested results could damage public trust and leave the mystery more tangled than before. Yet the campaigners counter that ambiguity already rules. They argue that refusing to test when all the tools and consent are in place is not respect for the dead, it is fear of the living. As the pressure mounts, the question becomes not if the test can be done, but why those with the power to permit it choose to keep the truth locked away. A DNA test that fails to match the Abbey bones to the princes would detonate centuries of official certainty. The marble urn, the Latin inscription, the solemn ceremonies, all would collapse into a story of mistaken identity and institutional error. Historians who have long doubted the narrative would find their skepticism vindicated. The chain of evidence, already fragile, would snap completely. The 1674 discovery, once treated as a neat solution, would be exposed as a hasty guess built on Tudor propaganda and the convenient alignment of rumor and rubble. Thomas More's account, the backbone of the traditional story, would lose its last claim to authority. More, writing decades after the fact and under Tudor rule, described a secret burial beneath a tower staircase. It was this detail that made the 1674 find so compelling to restoration officials. Without a DNA match, More's version would stand revealed as hearsay, not history, a tale crafted to legitimize a new dynasty by blackening Richard III's name. The consequences would not stop there. If the bones are not the princes, then the fate of Edward V and Richard of York is once again wide open. Survival theories, once dismissed as fringe speculation, would surge to the forefront. The claims of Perkin Warbeck, the boy who appeared at European courts insisting he was Richard, Duke of York, would demand fresh scrutiny. Exile, secret imprisonment, or escape become as plausible as murder. Every book, play, and lesson that treated the Tower Bones as proof would be forced to reckon with the possibility that England's most famous child victims were never found at all. The story would shift from closed case to cold case, its ending ripped away by a few strands of DNA. A DNA match between the Abbey bones and the prince's maternal line would settle one of England's oldest questions with a finality that leaves no room for comforting ambiguity. The science would speak. Edward V and Richard of York died as children, their remains hidden beneath the tower, exactly as the traditional story claims. In that moment, centuries of speculation would collapse into a single brutal fact. The marble urn would become not just a symbol, but a tomb for murdered heirs, their fate no longer a matter of rumor or propaganda, but of genetic proof. For those who have spent decades defending Richard III, the consequences would be devastating. Every argument about Tudor lies, every protest about the absence of evidence, would be swept away by a few strands of mitochondrial DNA. The case for Richard's innocence, so carefully built by revisionist historians and passionate societies, would shatter. The king's defenders, who have long insisted that the story of the wicked uncle was a smear campaign, would face a new reality. The science does not lie, and the bones bear silent witness against him. A match would also harden the narrative of state-sponsored murder. No more room for survival theories, imposters, or lost princes living in exile. The timeline would narrow to a single summer in 1483, when two royal boys vanished behind the tower's walls and never emerged. The murder of children, sanctioned or covered up at the highest levels, would stand as the true legacy of Richard III's brief and bloody reign. The Abbey's refusal to allow testing would no longer look like caution, but like the last defense of a story too painful to face. In the end, the match would not just confirm a crime, it would force the nation to confront the darkest page in its royal history. Today, the remains rest untouched behind locked doors as advances in DNA science outpace the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. When institutions guard old certainties against modern evidence, history becomes a matter of privilege, not proof. The power to settle this mystery exists now. So does the choice to keep it unsolved. In the end, how we handle these bones reveals how much truth we actually demand. Share your thoughts below. Does the truth matter more than tradition?